Good afternoon, team. Welcome to the semi-finals. Delighted to have you here. We're very excited about your presentation, so away you go.
Thank you very much. And good afternoon. My name is Robbie. I am Head of VAT Reform at HM Treasury. However, I began my career in the civil service working in research and evidence. Now, when I moved over to tax policy, I soon realised that there was a gaping hole in the data that we were using to model complex macroeconomic behaviour. Experiments. Previously, I'd been working with policymakers and academics, bringing these two groups together to conduct policy experiments specifically designed to generate data on government policy interventions. Now, I'll give you an example. I would work with a team to identify different approaches to roll out in parallel to the delivery of early stage childcare. Now, we would then be able to identify the approach that was most effective before rolling this approach out at the national level. However, in tax policy, it struck me that the data that we were using to inform our evidence base was limited to observations of the trends in the economic data lined up with our understanding of the economic theory. Now, data derived from experiments, rigorous policy experiments carried out in the real world, was noticeably lacking. We're making evidence-based policy, but with one arm tied behind our back. Now, it soon became clear that there were perfectly good reasons why it wasn't possible to obtain this type of data. First of all, politically, it feels unfeasible. Do we really expect ministers to be willing to sacrifice the objectives of their political programs simply for the long-term objective of improving civil service learning? And even if they were, often legally it would be impossible. To take an example from tax policy, can we really envisage subjecting one part of the population to a higher rate of taxation, another part of the population to a lower rate, simply to observe the outcomes and draw some kind of conclusion about the optimal level of taxation? I don't think so. And finally, law and politics aside, I think it would be unethical to conduct such experiments in the real world. So I wondered to myself, could we not create a virtual environment, a safe space, if you will, where these types of large-scale government interventions could be rigorously tested before being rolled out in the real world? And herein our proposal to build such a virtual environment, to create a virtual environment, a pilot virtual environment that we'll be able to use to conduct a simple experiment on the effectiveness of different tax audit interventions. Now, this will in and of itself generate data that will be really useful to inform HMRC audit policy. But most importantly, this will stand as a proof of concept. A proof of concept that data generated from experiments conducted in virtual environments can tell us something useful about the real world. That is, that this data is generalizable. Now, our ultimate aim would be that such virtual environments are systematically used to rigorously test those types of large-scale policy interventions that were previously believed to be beyond the reach of traditional experimental methods. Now, to give you an idea of the sums involved, these types of policy interventions involve large sums of money. For example, just a 1% decrease in the rate of income tax will cost the government £5 billion per annum. So, if we can make just a small improvement to the degree to which we can understand the effects of these types of intervention, we could be saving the government easily tens of millions of pounds per annum. Now, the Civil Service Data Challenge has brought me together with a team of experts, and together we have brought this idea one step closer to reality.
Thanks, Robbie. I love the idea of improving evidence for policymaking. I'm Anna, an economist that works at the Department for Education. So as Robbie has said, there are limitations when running traditional experiments. And by this, I mean face-to-face experiments. So focus type of exercise, bringing a group of people, giving them instructions, running the experiment for a few days, collecting the data on their behavior. But this has some limitations. So first of all, traditional experiments are normally run with small sample sizes. They are also expensive and take a long time. They are also inflexible, so you cannot change them once you've started, and they are difficult to adapt to other policy fields. They are also, they might bring unintended consequences for the population, economy, and environment, and they might face ethical and legal barriers, as Robbie has mentioned. So what virtual environments can do is to change these limitations into opportunities. So for example, using virtual environments will make it easier to encourage larger amounts of participants in a digital platform than in person. It will be cheaper to run the experiments, so we can run more and more often. We will get real-time data, so the results from players will be fed through and analyzed in real time, so that will provide us with more timely results. We will avoid any real-life impact, so virtual experiments don't affect people's lives. This will provide us as well with flexibility, so researchers can change the experiment to suit different policies, and also that will enable collaboration with others in different fields. And finally, there will be the policy experiments will remove the ethical and legal barriers. But for this to be brought into reality, I needed a live experiment to be replicated, and that's when I spoke to Dan, a tax expert.
Thank you, Anna. So we've discovered lots of opportunities in this space, and maybe one of our greatest challenges has been choosing one for a test case. So hi everyone, I'm Dan. I'm a tax specialist in HMRC. I have a background in commercial tax, technology development, and also microsimulation traffic modelling. The project team have decided on a test case based on a previous HMRC in-person experiment that was based on compliance behaviours, where users were rewarded for in-game play performance, but were required to complete a tax return before their net gains were realised and we received insights. Unfortunately, on that project, the test was considered to be too small to be statistically reliable, which is a common problem with such tests. This is where our virtual environment comes in. We have now the opportunity to scale this, make it reliable, open this up to many users, not just for this test case, but for many more. Pass you on to Anthony.
Thanks, Dan. The technical implementation of this experiment and challenge is what really excited me about getting involved. Hi, I'm Anthony Walker, an air quality and data scientist at DEFRA. So what do we mean by the virtual environment? In this instance, for this test case, ultimately we're talking about the gamification of a tax return process. What we want is a place where users can easily navigate and get involved with the environment. We want policymakers to be able to pull levers and change outcomes in the experiment, and we want a place where academics can get involved with the data and perform research and write-ups. So what does this kind of look like? Ultimately, we want a kind of web-based app that users can engage with and navigate, play a few games, earn an income, and declare their taxes. We then want policy teams to then come in and act as the tax man and perform audits on players at random according to the experiment. And we want to be able to create a space where we can grow this environment easily with the player base and encourage players. We're thinking with monetary incentivization ultimately. And the aim really is to scale this long term with different policy areas, kind of attaching modular experiments to the environment with the already existing and scaling user base. Talking about next steps, I'll hand over to Rubina.
Thanks, Anthony. So can you see the potential of a virtual environment? I hope that you can. So what I'll do is spend the next minute bringing this concept to a landing. Now, myself and Zanedu couldn't be here today, and the rest of the team, we have worked hard to evolve this concept, which existed in the mind space, and we moved it into the virtual space, but we want to bring it into the virtual environment, and that's where you come in. Now, if you take us through to the next round, we will develop and build a prototype of a virtual environment, which will be a web-based app. And we've been collaborating with experts in this field, like the Alan Turing Institute, that are pioneers of research into artificial intelligence, as well as UK universities who've developed a similar platform and with success, as well as the Government Behavioural Insights team as well. Now, just imagine a virtual environment in the next 6 months. Now imagine it in a year, in 3, 5, 10 years. Where could this end up? Now, we believe a virtual environment could simulate real-world events like Brexit, like the pandemic, like migration, enabling users to log onto a central interface, make decisions, get feedback, and allowing us to observe human behaviour. Now, we've evolved this concept to exist in the virtual space. You will decide whether this concept exists in the virtual environment.
Thank you, Robina. Now, as you can see, this is clearly a very novel idea. It would generally be breaking new ground, so I'm sure on that basis you have plenty of questions for us. So I think without further ado, over to you guys in the panel.
Thank you, everyone. Really, really good presentation. Lots of food for thought there. Who would like to kick us off?
Can
Alison?
Hi team, Alison from ONS, and excited by this kind of thinking. Let's be clear right up front. Interesting, you never mentioned the word digital twinning once, which was intriguing because so my question is, where does this data flow through to, or do you envisage this environment to be almost like a closed loop of testing different policy potential and policy interventions, or do you see is there an opportunity for this to support synthetic data, which can then be utilised for policy evaluation downstream or generally? I'm interested in what that journey looks like.
I can initially field that question, but guys do come in because it's quite a big question. I would see this type of data fulfilling both of those functions. I think that, for example, if I understand digital twinning correctly, this is a form of modelling, and modelling, as we know, is based on assumptions about how humans, how businesses, how sometimes even viruses behave in certain environments and in response to certain stimuli. Now, the experiments that we conduct in a virtual environment could give us a more accurate portrayal, representation almost, of how those, humans, businesses, viruses, do indeed behave. And we can almost plug that data in to where previously our data was based on, as we probably all understand, there's quite a lot of assumptions sometimes underneath these macroeconomic models. And then kind of secondly, I would see this data also outflowing into kind of much more simple models. I know, for example, in tax policy, we just regularly build very simple models of the effects of different changes to the UK's tax regime. And again, we're basing these on a lot of assumptions. If we could actually have decent data rather than economic theory to inform what the values of those assumptions as represented within the models, I think those models would be far more accurate in the real world. Do you guys have anything to add?
Yeah, can I come in? So I think it's worth saying initially when we kind of blue skied this concept, we had thought, can we simulate the economy, which was a bit grandiose. So we scaled it down to this test case, which is a very closed loop experiment with the tax return game. And then we've tried to envisage a virtual environment that we can scale kind of modularly with adding different policy areas that eventually we'd hope would become like a digital twin of different policy areas that we could use the same user base for, akin to the population. And then we have these different policy areas in there that maybe we'd edge towards that kind of digital twin of like the economy or whatever policy area we're looking at.
Quick follow-up, if I may. So, and do you think that the policy environment is mature or sophisticated enough to be able to make use of what you could end up building? Or how are you going to manage the risk of you developing a fantastic little thing and everyone sitting outside of it going, I don't really understand how to make use of this?
Is it worth, I'll just come in. So I think initially with the closed loop kind of experiment environment that we've envisaged and scaling it down, simplifying it, because there are existing experiments in this space, and then we can collaborate with academic research and behavioural insights teams, we can then validate the results to show that, okay, they are representative and we can utilise them in the policy space, and that will encourage policymakers to kind of take the data on board and kind of agree with the data with some sort of confidence, because it's been validated, as an experiment that's been validated, and then we can scale and grow and continue to validate. I mean, we were talking around iterations of life cycles of the game and the environment to say, okay, maybe in the first season you validate your results against the population before you start making experiments and things like that. So I think it's about giving the policymakers the confidence that we've kind of done the validation.
If you progress, I would suspect ONS can help with some of the methodology oversampling, for instance.
Yeah.
Fantastic. I think it'd be really important for us to bring as many kind of variety of experts in, because what will really be crucial is we get the design right so that we actually produce data and not rubbish.
Yeah. Question for understanding, do you have any relevant comparable cases in the non-political world where organisations are taking a similar approach to experiments, or is this entirely novel?
I wouldn't say...
I'm sorry, I'm Simon from the Home Office, apologies.
Thanks. Yeah, Simon, I wouldn't say that this is just an idea plucked out of thin air. There are kind of sporadic experiments here and there. I know Robina has done a bit of research into actually what's out there. Could you...
Yeah, there was an example of a university in Sheffield that simulated a virtual platform similar to this to increase student engagement. And they developed a platform. The users could log onto a user interface, and the idea was to increase student engagement, and they had success. So it has been piloted at Sheffield University as well as other institutions as well, and it has worked.
The key difference, I guess, between these examples and what we're suggesting is, whereas they just built something on an almost a one-off basis on a policy area that was kind of clearly very amenable to this, what we're proposing almost is to build an environment that then can be, as Anthony explained, kind of built up modularly to be kind of a flexible environment where kind of any kind of experiment can ultimately be carried out.
And that's really helpful, thank you. And what population size do you envisage here? How many players does the game have?
Well, I mean, when thinking about this, I've always kind of for me, the sky's the limit, but then again, I work in policy, so I'm kind of more ideas than reality. So maybe Anthony's better placed to kind of talk about the technical limitations.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like a user base, a player base, that technologically there are existing examples of mass online games and mass multiplayer games, social media engagement or websites. So in terms of, we're talking millions, would be the goal, right? And we'd have a sufficient sample of the population that's representative. I think when we're designing this small scale kind of pilot, you know, we'd be hoping thousands and tens of thousands, hopefully. What we're going to try and do, and I can't remember if I touched on the presentation, but maybe create some sort of monetary incentivization to the game system so that players are not just engaging for no reason. There's a reward at the end of the season that people will be able to tap into and say, okay, if I've earned the most in the income and got away from the tax man, not that we encourage the behavior, but like to be representative of the experiment, that there's an end goal and a reward there. And that's might be how we incentivize players to kind of get involved with the system and not just ask people to get involved.
To give you an idea of scale, the experiment that Dan talked you through involved 97 participants. So our aim is to almost, how would I say, like soup up the experiment. And we're starting from a very low bar. Even if we got, 9,700, that's a small game, but that still is timesing that sample size by 100.
It's worth saying as well, in the technical implementation, we've tried to think, let's make it cross-platform accessible, web-based rather than an app or an iPhone app or something. So it's as accessible to as many people as possible so that we can try and get a large sample of the population to make it representative.
Hi guys, I'm Aiden from HMRC. I thought that was great. I love seeing every part of government kind of involved. This is a beautiful kind of collection of different parts of government, so I think that was great. You had me at the word virtual. I love this kind of stuff. So you can see I'm always salivating at the prospect of. Can you just talk a little bit about where you see, and you mentioned the numbers, which is useful in terms of the tipping point. If we get to 10,000, that's a useful. Where do we start to see the kind of benefit or the outcome from this? So if we think about the HMRC example, that experiment, what's the outcome we think we'll get from this initial pilot phase that will help inform tax policy, I guess, or something else? What is that kind of for you guys?
Shall I could come in after you, Dan, if you want to talk about the initial benefit you could see from a kind of compliance perspective in the short term, and then I could talk about the kind of longer term vision.
Yep, sure, definitely. So the vision that we have is really just to build on what was done before as a starting place, and that's why we chose that test case before. So essentially we've got one step further forward already before we even start. And essentially what we're trying to do there is trying to better understand the different factors and levers that might be at play for people when they decide to make a tax return to HMRC, and also within different conditions, how we can manipulate or enhance people's decision making to make the right choice at that first opportunity rather than through an audit later on down the line. So the idea is to set up different conditions, different test cases within the samples that we produce, and essentially just trying to observe the different types of behaviour that we see. And really from that behavioural observation is then to try and derive what the insights are, rather than just now trying to get to a predefined outcome of what we think the answer will be. Is to essentially set up various tests and let's see what the outcome is and learn from that.
But to improve compliance, basically.
Exactly.
That's the kind of, if you like, key measure for us in terms of whichever scenario we run. And then just very quick follow-up, because I'm conscious of time. When you think about the Sheffield example, how many users did they get to for it to become kind of useful for them? Do you have a sense of that scale, roughly?
I think when they rolled out the virtual environment experimentation, it was done on the students in the university. And the aim was to increase engagement and motivation. So, you know, it was just rolled out to the students within that university. And all of the users that engaged onto the platform, the results that came back, they saw a spike in motivation from the students and a spike in engagement. So the experimentation that was carried out by the researchers at the university was a success. And there have been other examples as well where this has been rolled out.
Is it worth saying? I mean, I guess in terms of like a raw number, maybe you're thinking of, we've got a population of self-employed or people that submit tax returns, and there's a number there, and probably some of the work we want to do with the academics, with the behavioural insights team, maybe with collaboration with ONS, is talk about what is representative sampling and what that number threshold is for the experiment, because, you know, I think that informs how we scale the product and how we get it to, you know, do we need to reach 10,000? Do we need to reach 20,000? You know, ideally we want as many people as possible, but what is the minimum viable kind of product for that? And I think maybe that's some well, I'm not a social researcher by nature, so it's working with those people to understand what is the finite number that we need to get to and scale accordingly, right? Because you can start small and that'll be sufficient, or you need to grow.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Hi everybody, I'm Sue. I thought that was a great presentation, because I don't think we've seen anything like this from a policy perspective of bringing data-driven policy making really into a different space than working alongside analysts. I had one observation for you about where you said what it's like that's going to be different in this kind of concept that you've got. I think it doesn't entirely remove the ethical considerations. I think it's a different set of ethical considerations for you in the design of whatever the experiments are, because there's still going to be the considerations about bias and potentially then how the experiments are run. The one thing that is striking me though, because of the variety of departments represented, is who do you see as ultimately owning and managing this if you do get beyond the proof of concept stage and then into the scaling stage? Does it sit with individual departments, or does it need to sit somewhere else? Have you thought that through?
We've had brief discussions about this, haven't we? We think initially it could sit with, between HMRC and Treasury. That's a very common form of kind of collaboration, the policy partnership. And that's because the case that we'd be examining would be specifically focused on tax compliance. In the longer term, we'd see this sitting in the centre of government and various departments who have policy questions that fit the bill feeding in to this team, and then coordinating with them to work out whether this is the kind of policy question that would be amenable to testing in a policy environment, and then working with them to conduct that experiment.
Okay, one very good question.
One just very. So obviously I'm Henry. We met already because we talked before. So
It was great to see the kind of tax example. I thought that was fantastic. I think one of the things that I would just wanted to ask, in terms of getting, I invest in startups. I've kind of built a startup myself to nearly 1 million customers, but it cost me like tens of millions of pounds to get to 1 million customers. And you guys need to get a lot of users, right? Like, I think this idea that 10,000 would be enough, given that, because it's a virtual world, it is not going to be the same. It's not going to be replicated the same human behavior in a virtual world as a normal world, I don't think. And therefore, to counter that issue, you're going to have a massive sample size. So I think maybe the scientists will say differently, but it's going to have to be a decent size. So I guess the question to you guys is, how are you going to go about getting those customers in a kind of environment where you can't necessarily spend lots of money on Facebook ads to get people to go into the thing, or whatever it might be, and what kind of route? And I think if you get to the final, that would be a big question I think that would need to be answered. Perhaps there's a way you can just force people to have to do this when they literally do their own statement, their own, whatever it might be. But I think that feels like a big problem, because the other option is to run AI through it and just run a whole load of bots through it and do millions of bots to just try and come up with see what happens if you run it straight through OpenAI or something like that. That's one other option. I just think that those two, how you approach that feels because you could build something amazing and then you can't get any users. And I've seen God knows how many startups happen with that, right? So.
I think that's definitely a fair observation. It's something we've actually grappled with, especially since we worked together on this a couple of weeks ago. I think for me, what's important to remember is that we not aiming to compete with these mass online multiplayer games that attract millions of users interacting in those virtual environments every day. What our aim is to beat what we've already got, which is not much, I know, but it's all that we've got to work with when we're making macroeconomic policy, and we want to look to experimental data to tell us about causal relationships between the variables that we care about. The bar is quite low there. That doesn't mean we should aim low, but we're proposing that given the size of the problem, just marginal gains will result in pretty big absolute gains. Now, we've talked about ways in which we could attract users. We think that, one, using monetary incentives, so offering prizes to users would be a good way of bringing them in. Also, just general publicity. But finally, as well, we can make the virtual environment fun to interact with. And that already represents a massive advantage over a typical experiment where, as you say,
you can make filling tax in fun. We'll take you out of the virtual world and put you on doing the actual ones.
We probably chose that example, but I think we can at least make it far more fun than a bunch of usually undergrad students being dragged off to a big auditorium or something and made to just sit down and fill in tax returns. So we can make it engaging, we can use monetary rewards, and that way we're beating traditional experiments and bringing the experimental method to a far greater range of policy questions.
Is it worth just coming in quickly that with the tax return example, we have an existing communication channel to people filling out their tax returns, right? It's not an unknown user base, and that's the population we're trying to sample. So there are definitely channels that we have that are open already to get this kind of environment out and say, look, we're doing this at the same time, there's a reward. That might incentivize people to click the link, or we have that channel open. And on your latter point about bots, we did investigate that at the start. There were a couple of technical challenges with machine learning, reinforcement learning bots and things like that. So we did examine that route, and actually maybe the design of the system environment initially would be for human players, but allow kind of a bot player base that might supplement while we have low count numbers. But there's a bit more tricky technical considerations in terms of validating the experiment. It's not actual human behavior. You have to train the bot, all those kind of.
I think if there's anything that you could reduce for a final, if you get there, that would make, we talked about this, right?
Well, we mocked up that. That image was a mock-up of something that we put together already in spare time. So there's a lot of no-code builders and stuff I can utilize to get something up quickly.
Cool.
On that note, we are at time. So thank you very, very much, folks. Really, really good presentation.
Thank you very much.